Robert Downey Jr.'s life story is a complex tale of a Hollywood bad boy on the brink, a saga of damnation and redemption, and the story of a true superhero. Back in 1999, however, Downey was dressed in orange jail clothes and shower sandals, pleading with a California judge to send him back to drug rehabilitation rather than prison. "It's like I have a shotgun in my mouth, and I've got my finger on the trigger, and I like the taste of the gunmetal." It was a spectacular fall from grace for the Oscar nominee, but everyone, including, it seems, Robert Downey Jr., saw it coming. Having already blagged his way through 6 rehab programs and breached prohibition 3 times, the actor admitted that he possibly showed up 5 minutes late for the miracle. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and released early. Remarkably, it was just one of the many pivotal moments in the incredible life of Robert Downey Jr., aka Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, aka inmate number P50522. Robert was 5 years old when he starred in his first film, Pound, 1970. By age 6, he was sipping white wine and smoking marijuana at home, encouraged by his father. At 8, Robert was a drug addict. It was the only kind of childhood love he understood. Drugs were always lying around the family home in Greenwich Village, a bohemian enclave in Manhattan. Downey was born in 1965 into an artistic family. His father, Bob Downey Sr., was an avant-garde filmmaker at a time when underground counterculture movies and theater were thriving. His mother, actress Elsie Downey, once Bob Sr.'s muse, was dealing with her own downward spiral of alcohol addiction that would eventually lead to his parents' divorce in 1978. Robert learned the trade on his father's film sets and moved to Santa Monica, California to live with Bob Sr. after the divorce. Sean Penn, Rob Lowe, and Emilio Estevez were his high school contemporaries. But Robert dropped out at 16 to pursue acting full-time. By the time he was living with then-girlfriend Sarah Jessica Parker, he was making a name for himself off-Broadway and jetting between New York and Los Angeles. Downey was referred to as one of the Brat Pack, the young Hollywood elite who included Ali Sheedy, Demi Moore, Judd Nelson, and Rob Lowe as members. Robert wasn't ready to say goodbye to drugs just yet, however. Downey was speeding down Hollywood's Sunset Boulevard in 1996 when he was arrested for possession of heroin, cocaine, and an unloaded .357 Magnum pistol. A month later, still on parole, he trespassed into a neighbor's home while intoxicated and fell asleep in a child's bedroom. California's judges were losing patience. He'd breached probation 3 times by failing to submit drug tests. When he appeared in court again in 1999, Downey was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Still, it wasn't Downey's last appearance before a judge. In 2001, he was given probation and went into rehab. In April 2005, Hollywood trade publications reported an item that, at the time, seemed merely somewhat interesting and a little puzzling. It appeared that Marvel, the venerable comic book publisher, had secured a $525 million revolving line of credit with Merrill Lynch to establish its own film studio. This was interesting because it seemed to be a pretty bold move for a company that had just emerged from bankruptcy 7 years prior. And it was puzzling because Marvel had clawed its way back to relevance in large part by licensing its most popular characters to other studios. Fox had recently fielded 2 successful films based on the X-Men, and Sony had done the same with Spider-Man. With all of its characters except C-listers spoken for, it was worth wondering what exactly Marvel hoped to accomplish. At the time, it was reported that Captain America and Nick Fury were among the properties most likely to be developed first, but behind the scenes, things were moving in another direction. Marvel had recently reacquired the rights to Iron Man, a founding member of superhero team The Avengers, after they had been bounced around to various studios for the previous 15 years. Intensive market research had suggested that old Shellhead, as he was affectionately known by fans, was more likely to strike a chord with younger skewing audiences. And so it was that, in April 2006, the newly minted Marvel Studios announced that it would hire Jon Favreau to direct its first feature, Iron Man, with the search for a lead actor underway. Of course, we all know what happened next. Today, Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark ranks among the most iconic pairings of actor and role of all time, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the biggest film franchise in history. But Downey was never a shoo-in for the part, and in an alternate universe, he never landed the role he was born to play. Iron Man flopped, and the MCU never existed. Favreau began speaking to the press about his exciting new project quite early in the production process, which is how we know that the director had a pretty darn solid vision of where he wanted to go with Iron Man from the very beginning. In May 2006, barely a month after his hiring was announced, Favreau was outlining for MTV News the bones of what fans could expect from his picture, and the details he offered at that time turned out to be remarkably accurate. Iron Man, he said, would take place in the present day, and would be an origin story in which we would see the old gray Iron Man suit, which would eventually progress into the more modern look. The story would explore Stark taking on this alter ego of Iron Man and developing the suit, and deal with what happens politically within the Stark Corporation. There was one key detail, though, about which Favreau would soon be whistling a different tune. Taking a cue from the then recent success of Fox and Sony's Marvel movies, the director warned fans that they shouldn't expect to see a name actor taking on the title role. What's nice is that those movies don't require an expensive star. Iron Man's the star, the superhero is the star, Favreau said. The success of X-Men and Spider-Man without being star-driven pieces reassures executives that Iron Man does have an upside commercially, via IGN. To be sure, there's something to be said for that strategy. Christopher Reeve, for example, had been an unknown until he was cast in 1978's Superman. And that had worked out pretty well. Indeed, early in Iron Man's casting process, Favreau was looking at actors who weren't exactly household names, including one who would pop up later in the franchise in a much different role. At the time, Robert Downey Jr. was known for two things: being a phenomenally gifted, Oscar-nominated actor for 1993's Chaplin, and seemingly being determined to enact his own self-destruction via drugs and alcohol. His struggles with substances throughout the 90s and into the new millennium had led to more than a couple very public flameouts, and between 1999 and 2000, he had even served nearly a year in prison on drug and weapons charges. Since then, though, he had diligently raised his profile through appearances in flicks like 2003's Gothica and 2005's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and Favreau saw in him an actor who could convincingly portray Stark's cockiness and arrogance, as well as his self-doubt and inner turmoil. In order to get his man, though, the director would have to persuade Marvel Studios. Years later, in a 2014 interview with a Texas radio station, Favreau would clarify that he had suggested Downey to Marvel's brass multiple times and was repeatedly shot down. Fortunately, he was able to do perhaps the one thing capable of making those execs change their minds: get Downey in front of the camera for a screen test. Downey read 3 scenes: the back and forth with reporter Christine Everhart, Leslie Bibb, early in the film, a version of the banter with the soldiers in the Fun V during the movie's opening scene, and a debate with Stark's friend and confidant James Rhodes, Terrence Howard, that didn't make it into the final picture. The screen test finally brought Marvel around to the idea of casting Downey, and the rest, as they say, is history. That was all from us today, folks. See you in the next one.